to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're covering a historical but famous case from 1908. The murder of Caroline Luard in August of that year became a notorious unsolved mystery and has had people baffled since it occurred. Due to the location of the murder in a small village called Sealchart just outside Sevenoaks in Kent, it would later become known simply as the Sealchart murder. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. The village of Sealchart is located around 2 miles from the town of Sevenoaks in the county of Kent, in the southeast of England. Sevenoaks is only 21 miles from the centre of London and is now a popular commuter town due to its train station and convenient location close to the capital. Sealchart is a very small place where not much seemed to happen. That was until it was put on the map due to a murder that occurred there in 1908. Major General Charles Laward lived at Ightham Knoll in Sealchart with his wife Caroline Luard. Caroline had been born Caroline Mary Hartley in 1850 in the market town of Egremont in Cumbria, which is located just outside the Lake District National Park. In 1875, when Caroline was 25 years old, she married Charles Laward. Charles was 12 years older than Caroline and had been born in 1837. He was in the army and served abroad, working his way up to the rank of Major General. In 1888, it's known that the couple moved to Sealchart to the house called Ightham Knoll. The Luards were well known in the community and took part in many public and philanthropic activities. Charles worked as a Kent County councillor and knew many of the local people in the area. He also took an interest in rifle shooting and enjoyed attending rifle clubs and speaking to people about how to defend themselves. Caroline enjoyed taking part in charity work and was known for helping others. The couple had 2 children together, Charles Elmhurst and Eric Dalbiark. Both of their sons followed their father into the army, and during the early 1900s they were both serving in different parts of the world. Sadly, their son Eric died during a campaign in Africa in 1903. Their other son Charles continued to serve in the army, and Caroline and Charles fell into a routine in Sealchart, enjoying walks out together and socialising. On the 24th of August 1908, Charles and Caroline had decided to go out for a walk together along with their dog. The couple had planned separately that afternoon after they had been for their walk. Caroline was meeting a friend for afternoon tea back at their home at Ightham Knoll, and Charles needed to go to the golf club to pick up his clubs, as the couple were going away for a little bit in a few days. It's reported in the Jarrow Express on the 28th of August that the couple set off from their home, and it was known that it was around 2:30 p.m. that afternoon. Caroline had agreed to go out to get some exercise that day, and did not intend on going to the golf club with her husband. Charles would later state that he had parted ways with his wife at the wicket gate that led to the summer house. The summer house was owned by their neighbours, Mr. and Mrs. Wilkinson, and the Luards also used it sometimes as a little getaway. The gate led directly back to their home at Ightham Knoll, and so Caroline would have been able to get back to their house in time for her afternoon tea with her friend Alice Mary Stewart. The couple said their goodbyes at around 3 p.m, and Charles headed off in the direction of the Godden Green Golf Club. It's reported that Charles was seen on his journey to the golf club, heading in that direction at about 3:20 to 3:25 p.m. He was also seen by one of the golf club stewards at around 3:35 p.m. at the club itself. Several people saw Charles that afternoon, and he spoke to a number of people on his way to the club and while he was there. It's reported in the Daily Mirror newspaper on the 10th of September 1908 that Charles was seen on his way home from the golf club on the main road by Reverend Arthur Cotton. He later testified, "General Luard came towards me carrying 2 golf clubs and accompanied by a dog. I offered him a lift and he declined. He put the golf clubs in the car. We passed General Luard later on the main road as we came out of the woods, and he then got into the car and we left him at his own gate. The time I first saw him was 10 minutes after 4. The General chatted quite naturally. It was known that Charles arrived home at around 4:30, and Harriet Hewish, the parlour-maid at Ightham Knoll, later confirmed this. When Charles arrived home, he was surprised to learn that Alice Mary Stewart, his wife's friend, had arrived at the house, but that Caroline was not back yet. He initially explained to Alice that his wife should be back shortly, but after another 5 minutes passed, he became concerned. He and Alice decided to set out to find out where she might be a short while later. However, Alice later explained that she returned home at around 5:15 p.m, leaving Charles to continue to look for Caroline himself. It was certainly strange for Caroline to have missed tea with her friend, knowing that she had organised it and knew that she would be arriving at around 4:15 p.m. Charles continued the journey from their home and eventually reached the summer house, not far from where he left her before going to the golf club. As he approached the summer house, he realised that he could see something on the veranda. He quickly noticed that it was Caroline. Her body lay across the porch. Charles's description of what he saw at the scene was later described in the Daily Mirror on the 27th of August. He explained that at first he assumed she must have fainted as she lay on the veranda with her umbrella nearby. However, on closer inspection, he realised she hadn't. He said, quote, "On going closer, I saw blood on the floor and thought she'd broken a blood vessel. Going closer, I saw that her head and her face were covered in blood." He also explained that Caroline was laid partly on her front and that her hat had come off. The pocket on her dress appeared to have been cut open and she was missing all of her rings on her left hand. Charles realised that Caroline must be dead and decided that he needed to seek some help. It's reported in the Sevenoaks Chronicle and Kentish Advertiser on the 28th of August that Charles initially tried to contact Mr. Wickham, the coachman, who lived nearby. However, he wasn't in, so he went to Frankfield Stables, not far from the scene, and found Mr. Wickham there along with the butler. They returned to the scene and the police were contacted. It's reported that P.C. Marsh was the first on the scene and realised that they most probably had a murder on their hands. He decided to contact Sevenoaks immediately for help on the case. Police, along with a doctor, were dispatched from Sevenoaks to process the scene and examine Caroline's body. Superintendent Taylor and Sergeant Paramore arrived and began processing the scene, while Dr. Mansfield inspected Caroline. The scene drew in many of the local residents and neighbours who were astonished that something so awful had happened on their doorstep. How had this happened and who would have wanted to commit it? Caroline did not seem to have any enemies and she was simply walking back to her home. It seemed unthinkable. The scene was processed that evening and her body was later taken back to Ightham Knoll until an inquest could be arranged. News of the murder spread quickly and it wasn't long until newspapers nationwide began reporting on the Seal Chart murder. Police had established that Charles's initial thoughts that she had burst a blood vessel were not correct. Caroline had actually been shot, and it appeared that she had turned to face her assailant and had first been shot in the cheek, and then again close to her ear. The fact that Caroline had been shot led police to search the woods for any sign of a murder weapon or anything of possible importance to the case. The woods around the summer house, however, were very dense, and it proved quite difficult to examine all of it. The police were aware that this was a very serious crime, and decided that they needed to bring in Scotland Yard to help with the investigation. Chief Inspector Scott was called in from London, and when he arrived began helping detectives to search the area and to interview witnesses. It was clear that as Caroline had been shot, witnesses would be crucial to figuring out who had committed the murder. The evidence collected by the police and the witness statements were laid out at the inquest just 2 days after Caroline's murder on the 26th of August. There would be another 2 inquests into Caroline's death on September the 9th and September the 23rd, where further corroboration on some points were established. The inquest took place at Ightham Knoll and was conducted by Dr. Buss, the coroner for the Tunbridge Division of Kent. Interest in the case was high, and journalists crowded around outside to get pictures and information from the inquest. It's reported, however, that the coroner had been very strict on the limited access to the proceedings. Charles was one of the first people to give evidence at the inquest and explain what had happened on the 24th of August. He once again recounted the story of how he had been concerned that his wife had not arrived back for her appointment with her friend and went out to look for her. Charles was also questioned about his ownership of several revolvers in his home. He explained that he did own revolvers and that he did not keep them locked up. He did, however, say that he actually didn't know where the ammunition for the revolvers were at the time. He brought the guns for the jury to examine, and it was later found that these revolvers were a smaller caliber than the murder weapon, as it had been established that Caroline had been shot with a gun of a .320 caliber. This was later confirmed by Mr. E.J. Churchill, a gun and rifle manufacturer. He told the second inquest that he examined the bullets that had been recovered from Caroline's body and established that they were from a .320 bore weapon. The medical evidence was crucial at the inquest, and Dr. Mansfield laid out to the jury what he had found at the post-mortem. He confirmed that Caroline had 2 bullet injuries, one behind her right ear and one in the left temple. There was also a sign of blackening around the bullet hole. Mr. Churchill confirmed that he believed the bruising around the holes suggested that the revolver had been held around 1 inch from Caroline's ear, and in the case of the wound, it had been held 2 to 3 inches away. He also further established that the bullets could not have been fired from any of the revolvers that had so far been produced by police, including Charles's. Dr. Mansfield discussed the other injuries that had been found on Caroline's body. He stated that there were 3 small abrasions on her left hand, including a very small one on her second finger. This was consistent with the fact that her rings appeared to have been torn off her fingers in haste. During the different inquests, there was some confusion between the experts about the wound on the back of Caroline's head. At the original inquest in August, Dr. Mansfield described the wound as a blow to the head, and explained that he believed that it came from a blow from a large instrument. Dr. Walker, however, who assisted at the post-mortem, did not agree with Dr. Mansfield. He stated that he believed the wound had not come as a result of the attack on Caroline, but had happened when she fell backwards, most probably from an impact on a stone. At the final inquest, however, Dr. Mansfield stated that he had since changed his opinion and now agreed with Dr. Walker. He believed that there was a much smaller area of effusion than would have been there through physical violence, and he now believed she had most probably hit her head upon something when she fell. Another thing that both professionals agreed on was that the wounds that Caroline sustained from the gunshots could not have been self-inflicted. Important evidence also came from witnesses in the area at the time of the murder. The police had interviewed those close to the scene and those that knew the Lawards extensively and had come across several people that believed they heard gunshots at around the time it was thought that Caroline had died. It's reported in the Sevenoaks Chronicle and Kentish Advertiser that a gardener named Daniel Kettle had heard shots coming from the direction of the summer house at around 3:15 p.m. This corresponded with the time that doctors believed Caroline may have died, given that she had been dead around 2 hours before Charles discovered her. Mr. Wickham, the coachman, also reported that he heard shots at around a similar time. It's also reported that 2 woodcutters may have also heard the shots at around the same time and may have heard a woman scream beforehand. At the final inquest in September, the coroner explained to the jury that Caroline Luard was a woman who enjoyed a good standing in the community, and that from evidence provided by employees at the couple's home, she and Mr. Luard had a very good relationship. There was nothing to suggest a motive for why someone would want to cause her harm. He also further reiterated that none of the weapons at the home could have caused her injuries, and that they could dismiss the notion of suicide from the evidence that they had heard. The jury went to consider the verdict, and after 10 minutes returned with a verdict of willful murder against person or persons unknown, finally establishing that Caroline had indeed been murdered. This was a sad verdict, but necessary, as the police finally had conclusive proof that they were indeed working on a murder case. Since the murder, Scotland Yard had been working extensively, even bringing in bloodhounds to search the grounds in the immediate vicinity of the summer house. It was hoped that they would be able to find some evidence that may have been missed by the detectives. Unfortunately, this search did not lead anywhere, and it was thought that the heavy rain in the days after the murder may have contributed to a poor scent trail. The lack of motive or eyewitnesses severely hampered the investigation, and also the fact that they had been unable to find the murder weapon was a setback. Caroline Luard was not the usual victim of a murder, and the community could not quite believe that she had been killed in broad daylight so close to her home. On Friday the 4th of September, Caroline's funeral took place with what was described at the time as thousands of people in attendance. Hundreds of floral tributes were sent, and many people came out to pay their respects, including many members of the police force. Reverend J. Geiss conducted the service and reminded the congregation that this was not the first tragedy that had befallen the Laward family. He stated, "5 years ago I was privileged to say a few words in this church on the occasion of a memorial service for our dear friend's son Eric Laward. Today we have come to bury the mother of that soldier. It was at her request that I spoke a few words on that first occasion, and I am asked to do the same at her funeral. Before, death was due to the deadly African climate. The death we mourn today is one due not to the severity of nature, but to the cruelty of man." He also made a comment about Caroline's character and personality, stating, "We had an example in Caroline Mary Luard, who has served faithfully in her generation, who went about doing good, was wise in counsel and unfailing in sympathy and friendship." The area was shocked by what had happened, and unfortunately this would not be the last tragedy to befall the Lawards. While the police had been collecting any information they could about the murder, they had been receiving several anonymous letters about it. Charles had also been receiving similar letters, which all suggested that he had something to do with his wife's death. The letters stated that he had killed her, and the letter writer had also managed to send some of them to members of the jury at the inquest. The police tried to trace the author of these letters, but were unsuccessful. These were, of course, a source of further pain for Charles, and they also led to some in the community wondering whether he could have had something to do with it. Some rumours began to swirl around the area that Charles may have been responsible for Caroline's death. The evidence at the inquests, however, seemed to suggest that Charles could not have been her killer, given that he had been seen at the golf club by several different people, and that his guns did not match the murder weapon. This did not stop local gossip, however, and it was reported that it caused him a lot of anguish. Since his wife's death, Charles had been staying with friends, one of which was Colonel Ward, who lived at Barham Court in Teston, around 11 miles from Sealchart. He was a Member of Parliament and the Chief Constable of the county. It's reported in the Hull Daily Mail on the 18th of September that Charles had been staying with Colonel Ward at his home in Teston on the evening of the 17th of September. He had got up as usual, had his breakfast, had a bath, and wrote some letters. It was then known that he had travelled to the railway line near to Teston, between East Farley and Waterbury, just before 9 o'clock. He then jumped in front of a train that was heading towards Tunbridge and was killed instantly. It's believed that he also pinned a note to himself, stating to whoever finds him should take him to Colonel Ward. Letters were later found that were addressed to Ward, where Charles explained that he could not cope with the accusations that were being levelled at him, and that he intended on taking his own life. At the conclusion of the final inquest, Colonel Ward made a statement in reference to Charles's death. The police have ascertained beyond doubt that there is not the slightest foundation for any of these rumours or accusations made by letter or otherwise. News of Charles's death caused even more shock for the community, as it was another tragic incident in this already baffling set of events. The fact that Charles blamed the rumours and the anonymous letters on his decision to take his own life caused a stir, and once again put added pressure on the police to find out who could have committed the crime. It was evident that police did not believe that Charles Laward did have anything to do with his wife's death, and that had been stated at the inquest. However, it was also clear that the police had nothing else to work with. No new evidence appeared to have been produced to prove a suspect in the case, and the weapon had not been recovered. Despite the extensive help from Scotland Yard, detectives seemed to have hit a brick wall. Caroline's case remained unsolved throughout the rest of 1908 and into 1909. Without further evidence, the police were unable to progress any further with it, and unfortunately, it remained unsolved. A year passed in the case without any further announcements, but the community did continue to remember her with a memorial message being placed in newspapers to commemorate her death. There did appear to be some movement in the case, however, when it was announced that an arrest had been made. It's reported in the Yorkshire Evening Post on the 20th of September 1909 that 62-year-old David Talbot Woodruff had been arrested on the charge of feloniously and wilfully murdering Mrs. Caroline Luard. Woodruff had already been in Maidstone jail at the time of his arrest for common assault. He was described in many of the newspapers at the time as shabbily dressed and unconcerned looking. He was brought before the local police court on the charges, where Superintendent Taylor explained he had received a warrant for Woodruff's arrest and travelled to Maidstone jail to go and collect him. When the charges were read out against him, Woodruff reportedly said, "I never did such a thing in my life. I'm not guilty of murder or shooting or anything of the kind." When told he was going to be taken back to Sevenoaks, he said, "I've never been there in my life and I know nothing about it." Woodruff immediately protested his innocence in the matter and explained that he did not murder Caroline Luard. Superintendent Taylor at the court stated that he did not wish to elaborate further on the evidence that they had against him at the time, and he asked for Woodruff to be held on remand for another week so they could continue with inquiries. Mr. W. H. House, who was acting in Woodruff's defence, however, took issue with this and told the court that he did not think the police had a shred of evidence against his client. He stated, "I shall oppose that application. It seems to me that the police in this case have for some reason only known to themselves, but not known to anybody else, arrested this man upon suspicion. 13 months after this offence they arrest a man in Maidstone prison who is there on an ordinary charge of common assault. They take proceedings against that man and try to make a case against him. There is no reason why there should be a remand. I feel that the case is one that should never have been brought before this court. The police have had 13 months in which to find the man guilty of this offence, an offence which we all very much deplore. But here you have a man against whom there has never been any suggestion of this character before, until he is charged with another offence for which he committed at Maidstone. So far as I can make out, the only reason there was to arrest him was that at some point he had a revolver on him." Mr. W. H. House pointed out that Woodruff had been in prison for 4 months on the assault charge before his arrest, and he explained that the police had had ample time to make inquiries and should not now need another week to do so. He stated, "They do not propose to offer one shred of evidence today after 4 months. That is not fair." There was also discussion of the fact that his clothes had been taken from him in prison and he had been given other clothes to wear for court. This, the defence said, was also not fair, given that this was how he was seen by the court and the public. The police argued with this characterisation of events, however the chairman agreed with the defence, stating, "The bench is of the opinion that there is not sufficient evidence to warrant us ordering this man's detention." He was then immediately discharged from court. It's reported that there was cheering heard at the back of the court in response to this decision, but that this was suppressed. The court clearly agreed that the police's decision to not provide any evidence in relation to Woodruff's guilt meant that he could not be held on the charges. It was later reported in the Sevenoaks Chronicle and Kentish Advertiser that Woodruff was a gardener by trade, but had suffered from illness and lost his job. This, he said, led to him falling on hard times and getting involved in petty crimes, such as sleeping rough and getting involved in assault. He also confirmed that the police took away his clothes and provided him with others that were shabby and much too small for him. It was also confirmed that he had actually been in prison at the time that the murder had taken place the August before. The police did not bring any charges against Woodruff in the months or years after the arrest, and it appeared they did not intend on providing any evidence as to his guilt. It appears to me the police had perhaps acted hastily in the arrest of Woodruff, in an effort to find a suspect in the murder. It was clear that the case was proving difficult to solve. Over the years after Caroline's murder, there have been some theories put forward for what might have happened to her. Initially, it was reported that police believed that a vagrant may have been responsible for the crime due to the fact that Caroline's rings had been taken. This suggested that it may have been a robbery. However, as the months passed, detectives appeared to be more of the opinion that Caroline may have known her attacker. This theory seemed to have been based on the fact that Caroline had been stood on the veranda of the summer house as though waiting for someone, and had turned towards her attacker before she was shot. There was also some evidence that someone may have sent her a letter, trying to set up an appointment with her in the previous couple of weeks. This, however, was denied by her husband. This theory, however, always faced a setback. They could not find anyone that wished Caroline any harm, and the murder appeared motiveless. Could Caroline have been killed by someone she knew, and if so, why? Or had she been killed by a stranger who simply wanted to rob her? That would mean that her murder was completely opportunistic in nature, as the summer house was set back in quite dense woods. Whoever did commit the crime was someone who had access to a .320 bore revolver and possibly knew the area quite well. Despite the resources that have been put into the investigation, police have never got any closer to solving Caroline's murder. There has been some speculation about whether a man named John Dickman could have had anything to do with the crime. He had been convicted of the 1910 train robbery and murder of John Innes Nisbet, just outside Newcastle. It was reported that Nisbet had been shot with a .320 bore revolver and that money and gold had been stolen. Reportedly, police later found blood-stained trousers and gold sovereigns at Dickman's home, and he was arrested a couple of days later. He protested his innocence, and several people since have questioned his conviction, believing that 2 guns were used in the crime and not just one, suggesting that 2 people were complicit in the crime. Despite the appeals by several different people, Dickman was convicted and hanged that same year. A number of people looked at the case, including then Home Secretary Winston Churchill, who looked at the evidence and agreed he should be executed. Those that believe that Dickman's case was a miscarriage of justice have stated that they believe General Luard's friendship with Churchill and several other people with influence meant that Dickman was convicted for the robbery and murder because they believed he could have had something to do with Caroline's murder. From what I can find, the only evidence to show this appears to be the same caliber weapon that was used at both crime scenes. There have been no other suspects produced in the case, and as of the present day, the murder has not been solved. It has become a notorious case mainly due to how long it has remained cold. Caroline did not appear to have any enemies, and she did not deserve to be the victim of such a heinous crime. I'm glad that her memory has not been forgotten, and despite the time that's gone by, I really hope that people continue to talk about the case and discuss what may have happened. The Laward family really did suffer from a lot of tragedy, with their only remaining son being killed during the First World War. I really feel for their family and friends, and wish that answers would be forthcoming in this case, but due to its age, I worry that they may not be found. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I want to thank, as always, our Patreon supporters who really help to keep the podcast going. If you want to know about what we offer on there, including bonus episodes and ad-free early access, then have a look at the link in the show notes. If you want to support us further, you can leave us a review wherever you listen, or just connect on social media at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and also find us on YouTube, where you can subscribe. If you have any suggestions for cases, I would love to hear them, so please do contact me on social media or at theunseenpod@gmail.com. I hope to have you back next time, and as always, I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.